high needs funding. And just to say, there's a large number of us on this presentation, so if there are any technological glitches or disruptions, we'll do our best to resume, and we've got a bit of flexibility on time if that is the case. So yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Walter Bernard. I head up the ESFA High Needs Policy Implementation Team, working closely with colleagues across the DfE, ESFA and government as necessary. For the avoidance of doubt, this webinar presentation is, as I said, an introduction to the world that is high needs. So if there's anyone who's worked in the sector for some years, you may find parts of it very familiar and possibly less than riveting. But I'll do my best to keep your interest. I'll be providing an overview of the high needs funding arrangements and some of the component parts and processes in place which are pertinent to local authorities, or LAs as I will call you. And my colleague Russell Ewins, DfE, will spend some time explaining the changes to the 2023-24 Special Schools Minimum Funding Guarantee. And Benedict Coffin, DfE, will spend some time focusing on children who move between local authorities. Of course, have any very specific LA questions or schools and colleges in your patch, please use the .gov contact page, details provided later and in the high needs guide as well. And finally, as to say, the presentation is being recorded and a YouTube link will be circulated in the coming weeks. So this is an overview of the areas to be covered in this session. I'll give you 30 seconds just to absorb this and take in what we'll be going through. Okay, let's now get on to the main event. Let's start by showing you an illustration of the high needs funding formula. I won't talk through all of the elements here in the various coloured boxes, but simply say that the high needs funding formula, NFF, is what underpins the dedicated schools grant DSG high needs block allocations for individual LAs and local authorities across England. So just to kind of give an overview, you've got the basic entitlement on the left, you've got the 4,660 per pupil student, then you've got the proxy factors such as population, disability, and then towards the bottom there's AP, import, export, high needs funding, formula allocations, and some notes around that. So I want to take this opportunity to set out the main changes to the high needs NFF allocations for 23-24 and the provisional NFF allocations, which of course were published in July and will be updated in December. So the funding floor in the high needs national funding formula for 23-24 provides an increase of at least 5% to every LA on a per head population basis using the 22-23 baseline. This baseline is what LAs are receiving in the high needs funding allocations this financial year, and it includes the supplementary funding that was announced last December following the 2021 spending review. The limit on gains from the formula of 7% is the level before LA gains are capped. And also do note that we've continued to use the 2019 attainment data as a proxy for both the 2020 and 21 data. So that was either based on teacher assessments or missing altogether. Work continues on supporting LAs through the safety valve, delivering better value and just general support, which ESFA and DfE colleagues are providing on these programmes. And in all cases, DSG management plans provide an important tool for LAs to support your strategic budget planning. So do please, provide some close attention as you work these up and reflect further. So let's take a highlight. Let me take you through the highlights, I should say, of the operational guide, which then sets out the main funding information. And this is, of course, a supporting presentation to that. and it's specifically focused on activity funded through the high needs block. Although it's really important to say, we recognise in mainstream schools there's a significant interplay between what's funded between the schools block and the high needs block, where extra support and associated LA funding may be required. The 23-24 operational guide was published in August to help your budget planning exercise. So in one HTML document, it sets out all the main approaches, processes, supporting information for managing this at the local level. I appreciate this as a very long document and there's a lot to absorb, but we continue to do our best to improve the messaging. And for those of you who like still working with hard copies, you can use a printed copy, print this page quote unquote option, which is on .gov, which converts it to a PDF. But of course, any subsequent updates or revisions may be easily missed if the copy in your drawer is your main reference copy. So what are the main messages for funding for 23-24? So there's not too many in terms of big changes, but those which are worth flagging are there's new contextual information about local SEN responsibilities and accountabilities. The annual 23-24 funding overview, some of which I've covered, has been updated. There's brief information about the SEND and Alternative Provision Green Paper, which concluded its consultation in July. There's references to the notional SEND budget guidance. We've also included updates to Annex 1 and 2, the guidance around special schools, minimum funding guarantee and responsibility for children and young people who move between LAs. And of course, this is all set out in section 2 at the front of the guide. And we also define the as part of the different roles LAs play. So you have provider, local authority, commission, local authority, etc. In advance of publication, it was good to get some feedback from the various parts of the sector, including LAs, and we'll continue to gather further views in due course as we do, as I say, continually look to improve what information we provide to you. So do keep looking at the guidance regularly to remind yourselves of the key messages, timings, processes, and approach to core areas. As although many of you may be familiar, it's important to just look at some of the nuances as well, and any kind of messages which may help to explain things clearly. So to get you more into the topic, let me set out who is a high needs pupil. So there are four areas which cover the 0 to 25 age group. So firstly, you've got SEND children aged 0 to 5 who the LA decides to support from its high needs budget. And a large number of these, but not all, may have an EHCP. There are then pupils 5 to 18 with high levels of SEND across a range of settings, for example, maintained and academy schools, non-maintained and independent special schools, further education providers, special post-16 or SBIs. And here, high needs funding is only available for those in mainstream schools and NFE if the costs exceed £6,000 per year, or if they are in specialist provision, normally which is in their EHCP. Then you've got learners 19 to 25 in FE and SBIs who have an EHCP and require further support. And these costs exceed over £6,000. And finally, you've got all compulsory aid school children in pupil referral units or other forms of alternative provision by either the commissioned by the LA or a school. So many of you will be familiar, but a recap on the high needs funding basics, which I'll walk through in some detail on this slide. Please note that when I use the term schools and colleges, I mean all educational providers. So not all schools and colleges receive all elements of the funding. The funding approach will vary across settings, and core funding, as here, flows through as follows. So in mainstream schools and post-16, all pupils and students attract core allocations through the school's local funding formula or the post-16 national funding formula. LAs also can allocate a national send, which is included in schools' core allocations. And of course, as I said, we've published more guidance on this. It's important to note that these will not attract place funding, which, as I said, has a separate process laid out in the guidance alongside separate guidance to be published each year. So the place funding is allocated as an annual flat rate, which equates to core funding for specialist educational settings, and for SEND units, resource provision, the paid rate is 6k or 10k, but only for those pupils occupied by pupils on roll. For all unoccupied pupils, they're unoccupied places, I should say, rather than pupils, they are funded at 10k. It's really important that LAs get this right so we can pay the correct allocation as well as making sure the deductions are correct. So to expand on, ESFA relies on informing us, the LA's informing us about the number of occupied places at each school via the authority pro forma tool. There's a separate session taking place on this on the 29th of September, and some of you may have signed up. So it's important the data is correct to avoid 10k instead of 6k being removed. And then for special schools, aside from independents, pupil referral units and AP are paid at 10k. However, in FE and special post-16 colleges, the allocation is comprised of funding through the post-16 NFF and a 6k, or sometimes known as element 2 place funding. So these components are set out in the high needs guide in more detail. Place funding is really core funding for specialist schools and colleges, so it's important that that information is correct as a guaranteed budget for that academic year. So they need to have a level of certainty and financial stability. There is a lot here, but so just really some key points I want to reiterate on place funding. It shouldn't be withdrawn if place isn't occupied by an individual. LA should not seek to recover funding for unused places, and this is from the previous or the current academic year. However, an LA shouldn't automatically be charged an extra 6k or 10k by a school or college if a provider has filled all funded places, and this is irrespective of which LA has filled them. The provider LA is usually where the school or college is located or headquartered, and the provider LA must account for all other commissioning requirements in the final ESFA data return. So the top-up funding point I've put on the screen is, I'll cover this in brief in a bit more detail, is what LA's paid directly from their high needs budget. And then the other sort of area of funding flows from is service level agreements, and these are used where SEND or AP commission places from an LA are funded from its high needs budget in line with the finance regulations, and such services can be, as I said, commissioned by schools. So top up funding for element 3, as it's sometimes known, especially in post-16, is funding over above the core funding we talked about. Over recent years, we've sought to improve this section of the guidance, and schools and colleges receive varying levels of top-up funding as determined by the individual needs of pupils or students with high needs to allow them to participate in education and learning. So the LA which places a pupil or school maintains the EHCP, it's usually where they live, pays the required levels of funding to reflect the costs of additional support to meet their needs. It's important to say top-up funding is, of course, directed around individuals, so it's important that that support is really looked at in detail and reviewed. So top-up funding at the same time should reflect schools, colleges, costs, and their account for the various economies and diseconomies of scale, which can change over time. So this should be informed by under or over occupancy of places, local budgets, overheads, and additional costs. Many LAs deploy standardized rates or local banding arrangements, which is being rolled out to reduce detailed conversations about every student. But it's very important, as I said, to be mindful of the need to meet the statutory requirements of the Children's and Families Act. On the frequency of payments, monthly payments are the default, but this position, if it differs, should be communicated and mutually agreed with the schools and colleges. And as I said, the vast majority of top-up funding will be linked to educational healthcare EHCP plans, provision and outcomes, especially in relation to 19 to 25 students. But an EHCP is not a prerequisite for access to top-up funding. Important that LAs issue agreements confirming the final financial support rates, payment schedules and provision in writing. Previously agreed payments should not be delayed, even if there are payments which may be subject to further queries or evidence checking. This is something I want to highlight. We get lots of correspondence and disputes about, and it's really important that those earlier agreed commitments are adhered to, or at least if there are issues, that all parties are kept in the loop. So the import-export adjustment was introduced in 2018-19 so that LAs were compensated for the deductions made from their high needs allocations as a result of the commissioning decisions of other LAs and vice versa. I won't provide much detail here, as there is a separate import-export webinar which was produced in the summer, and the link is available at the end of the slide pack which you'll receive. Many of you also recognise that a considerable amount of high needs funding is allocated to local authorities based on children and young people who live in their area, regardless of where they are educated. But the LAs do face higher costs if they attract more pupils and students with high needs who live outside the area but come into their schools and colleges, but they fund the imports. The LAs that export pupils and students to others, such as a neighbouring LA, may face lower costs. So the 6K adjustment ensures the funding system reflects those differences in costs, and this will be recalculated every year, working outside both the funding floor and the application of the gains cap calculation. This adjustment is calculated as a net figure based on the following. So this is the real crux of what the adjustment is about. So it looks at the number of high needs pupils and students educated at a provider in the local authority area, minus the number of high needs pupils or students living in their area, and then the net number of pupils and students, which is either negative or positive, is then multiplied by £6,000. Do note, as ESFA allocate places for non-maintained special schools and SPIs, the adjustment is made to the allocation of the LA where the pupil or student is resident. This is even if the NMSS or SPI is situated within the same LA. We don't include alternative provision or AP in the import-export adjustment, as the data isn't robust enough. So it's really important local discussions take place how funding should be adjusted or reflected if there are issues there. And to ensure it's correct, it's vital that schools and colleges complete their census or ILR return accurately, and local authorities can help with that level of communication. So finally, here's a summary timeline of import-export key dates. Full details, as I said, set out in the high needs guidance, and then separate import-export guidance is issued to LAs as we get closer to the adjustments. However, here are some of those dates from next year, beginning with the guidance being issued and any data error returns from LAs. And then this is followed by outcomes and DSG updates, or as will be the case for 2023, which take when it's finalised in November. And then the import-export process, I should say, has also been refined in recent years since it was introduced, and we are continually reviewing feedback and correspondence on this to make improvements to this process, including having a stock take of the 22-23 process, which is concluding. So we'll be writing out to LA shortly with the final outcomes from this year's process, which will inform the update for the current 22-23 DSG allocations. I will talk very briefly about 23-24 place change process. It launches next month in respect of ESFA issuing LA workbooks and a guidance to inform the process for the 23-24 allocations to schools and colleges. We expect place numbers to be formally agreed between LA's local schools and colleges. So this is a process for ensuring this happens through mutual consent. Remember, when agreeing place numbers, LAs need to account for those places being commissioned by other LAs, for which you'll get compensated for via the import-export adjustment. So the total place number in an educational setting is a consolidated return of all places, whether or not they are occupied by your own student pupil residents. So LAs need to consider wider strategic considerations that may impact place change numbers, such as local demand, new provision, or changes to local arrangements from other commissioning LAs. Do note that AP3 schools agree their future funding directly with ESFA, as the place funding is provided by us and the DSD deductions are not on the basis of the place change process notification. LA should also use this process to request additional funding for changes in hospital education and separate hospital education funding guidance, and the updated place change process for 23-24 will be issued on .gov shortly. There's also the high needs collection presentation, which will take place on the 30th of September. Some of you may have already registered for that event. So this last slide from me provides a visual overview of the key dates coming up between now and the end of the current financial year to inform the 23-24 allocations and adjustments. Please do take a closer look at this in the high needs guide under section 5. And I'll just briefly say that this starts off with discussions with schools and colleges, which you may have already commenced. So do look at the current guidance, and it moves through the various deadlines and published information right through to some of the local EAC process and amendments. So I'll now hand over to Russell to present the second segment of this presentation. Thank you very much for your engagement on this topic and valuable work at the local level to support the respective learners and settings.
Hi colleagues, it's Russell Ewens here from the Funding Policy Unit of the Department. Before moving on to the Special Schools MFG section of the presentation, I'd think it might be worth just responding to a couple of questions in the chat relating to top-up funding and how that works across sort of local authorities. And I think the initial question was, do all local authorities fund other local authority schools top-up funding on their own rates or bandings? I think this is something that we often hear about, and there aren't any particular rules. And I think what I would want to do is turn this on its head a bit and say to local authorities, say to you guys, what are you deciding to do for your local authority, and basically you are in charge of determining the top-up funding. You don't have to pay, as we've said in the guidance, you don't have to pay what is charged by schools. And why do you not agree between yourselves with your neighbouring local authorities a common level of top-up funding? I know that's much easier said than done, but certainly that's what I know has been happening in some areas where there's been a bit more coordination around the levels of funding that are being determined by local authorities. So I don't think it's a question of what schools are charging, but what local authorities are deciding to pay. So I don't know whether that helps answer that query. but hopefully you can understand, and there's lots more guidance in the operational guide around top-up funding and how it's determined and how it relates to individual schools and individual pupils and students. Looking now at the minimum funding guarantee, the MFG arrangements that we've put in place for special schools. So as many or most of you will know, the MFG is the protection we offer all schools, mainstream and special. It used to be a negative percentage that limited year-on-year funding reductions for schools as a result of local formula or funding changes. But in recent years, as you'll be aware, with the significant extra funding for schools, mainstream schools have had a positive percentage MFG. And also we've sought this coming year, the 23-24 year, to provide a positive MFG for special schools. And the equivalent percentage for special schools is 3% per pupil over 2 years. And this is to ensure that the increase in funding that we've paid over to local authorities is passed on through not only for mainstream schools through the local formula funding, but also for special schools as well. And what we're saying is that the proposed 23-24 funding levels that local authorities should be looking at need to be compared with the 21-22 funding levels. So we are looking at that percentage as the equivalent to the mainstream schools MFG at 3% per pupil over 2 years. So we expect local authorities to review their top-up funding levels for all maintained special schools and special academies to make sure that the overall two-year increase complies with the MFG for next year. So unlike in previous years, when the MFG, I think most recently has been 0%, it's no longer an option for local authorities to do nothing. So we know that many local authorities will have already agreed to pass on to their special schools some of the increased funding that they've received this year. And that for all local authorities, that's a minimum of 12% per head increase in the overall high needs block. For those local authorities that haven't passed any money on or have not passed on sufficient to meet the MFG, we're asking them to review that, assuming that the 22-23 budget is available. It may not be too late to consider changes during this academic year, so that the costs are spread over 2 years, particularly bearing in mind the level of increase in high needs funding that is due to be paid next year and the cost pressures that schools are now facing. So this is something that all local authorities basically should be looking at now in terms of their top-up funding and considering with their special schools what the cost pressures are, how much of their high needs budgets they should be passing on to ensure that their schools are viable and able to make the provision that they require. Just one other thing is the pupil referral units and AP academies are not included in the MFG rules, but this doesn't mean that local authorities shouldn't consider increases in top-up funding for the excluded pupils they place in alternative provision. Those schools will also be facing cost pressures. The slide that you see there is quite small print. Hopefully the version that you're getting that has been emailed out will be a little bit clearer. But that's just simply to show the comparison we're making now with mainstream schools and the special schools equivalent. So those are a few of the different things there that I put in there about the the minimum funding guarantee, the protection that we're offering this coming year. One of the things that the next slide covers is where disapplication requests may be made, because exceptionally we obviously appreciate that there are some situations in which it may not be appropriate to pass on that funding, and those disapplication requests will be considered. So the next slide just explains that process, which is in much more detail in the operational guidance. So the first thing to say is that those local authorities that are planning to submit a disapplication request are encouraged to contact the ESFA before putting in a request, and preferably before starting the whole process of discussion and consultation with their schools. In the past, we have found sometimes that the prior discussion can lead to a different approach that complies with the MFG requirement. So rather than putting a request in and having it turned down, we always suggest that there is initial contact with the SFA before putting a request in. I've listed on the slide a couple of details there which should be included in the formal requests when they're made. Financial modelling is important. It's also important that local authorities will understand the affected schools' financial health and whether they've got reserves or deficits, and there is information online, and there are links in the operational guidance online about in-year balances, both for academies and maintained schools over previous years. And you can always look at that, as well as obviously discussing with and consulting with the schools affected and taking into account their views. So that's very important. There is a separate ESFA webinar on disapplications, and that I think is taking place on the 29th of September. And so many of you may have signed up to that as well. But this is just a brief reference to mainly the request to contact ESFA first. The other thing to say about this is that where there are safety valve local authorities, those requests will be handled separately. Benedict now to deal with the last section of the presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Russell. We get a number of questions about children and young people who move between local authorities, and what I think is most helpful here is on this slide and the next two to quote from Annex 2 of the High Needs Operational Guidance, which deals with this area. It's selective quoting rather than everything, and key points are being emphasised here in bold. The starting point is that local authorities are statutorily responsible for the special educational needs of the children and young people in their area. That's section 22 of the Children and Families Act 2014. High needs funding is allocated to local authorities based on the characteristics of the children and young people who live in their area. Children and young people who live in one area but are educated in another are dealt with through the import-export adjustments. And those who are in residential education placements, we consider that a school does not become your home. Even if you live there residentially, you remain living with your parents, even if that's for a relatively short time in a year, even in, for example, 52-week residential placements. So you will still be considered to live in your family home. That may well be different if you're in a residential social care placement, age over 18. So actually, as a young adult, you're placed somewhere that may well become your home. The point to emphasise here is that local authorities are statutorily responsible for maintaining the education, health and care plans of the children and young people who live in their area, and that includes responsibility for securing and funding that provision. Where a child or young person with an EHC plan moves from one local authority to another with the intention of the move to be permanent, their EHC plan must be transferred from the old to the new local authority as set out in the SEND regulations and the SEND Code of Practice. The new local authority must maintain the EHC plan in its current form until such time as it has reviewed it, and it must do that review either within 3 months of the plan being transferred or within 12 months of it being issued or amended, whichever is later. This therefore means that the new local authority will be able to reconsider and amend the plan if necessary, so that the provision specified reflects the new local authority's local offer. This approach also applies to looked after children with EHC plans, who are often placed in a different local authority to the one which looks after them. So where a placement is made in another local authority which is expected to be permanent, the EHC plan should be transferred to the new local authority, which must review the EHC plan in exactly the same way as with any other transfer. The looking after local authority will act as the corporate parent and will exercise relevant statutory rights on behalf of the looked after child if they're under 16. We've had a number of questions coming to us relating to recoupment of costs for looked after children. The recoupment regulations permit the home local authority, so the one where a child or young person lives, or I should say a looked after child lives, to recoup the costs of primary and secondary education, but not FE provision for a looked after child. You can recoup those costs from the local authority which looks after them. Historically, local authorities relied on recoupment of costs where looked after children were placed away from the looking after local authority. Following the introduction of the High Needs National Funding Formula, high needs funding is allocated mainly based on the characteristics of the population residents in each area, including any looked after children. So as we've set out in the operational guidance, recoupment should therefore only be necessary on an exceptional basis. Exceptional circumstances might include cross-border placements in Wales, for example, where the funding system is different, or short-term or temporary placements, in other words, ones which wouldn't mean that responsibility for maintaining the EHC plan would actually be transferred. And in such cases, the looking after authority may wish to consider funding provision directly. The key message that I would hope you take away from this is that responsibility for maintaining an EHC plan falls to the local authority where the child, including a looked after child, is resident, where they're actually living. Responsibility for funding the provision in a plan, through high needs top-up funding, for example, falls to that same local authority, because funding the provision is securing the provision, which is the statutory duty of the authority that maintains it where you live. So costs for children and young people who move between areas should not normally be passed on to a different local authority to the one where they're living, even in the case of a looked after child. Thank you.
Thank you all for your hopefully you've managed to get through this without any technical hitches, and yeah, thank you for your attention, but also of course for the wonderful work you do at a local level in supporting individual children, all the budgets and processes which are set out here. So thank you very much for all of that work at what is a very pressured and demanding time.